Picture this. It's a freezing morning in January 2026. Elite Danish combat troops are heavily armed, totally camouflaged against the Arctic snow of Greenland, and they're standing their ground with this chilling directive.
Right, the standing orders.
Yeah, they were operating under standing orders to shoot American soldiers on sight. I mean, if you were pitching this as a script for a political thriller, a studio executive would probably tell you it's, too far-fetched.
Oh, they'd laugh you out of the room. A global superpower threatening to militarily annex the territory of one of its closest democratic allies. Sounds like a Cold War novel.
Exactly. Not modern geopolitics.
Yeah.
But today, for you listening, we're looking at a scenario that isn't a movie script at all. We are unpacking the Greenland Crisis of 2025 and 2026.
And it is a wild ride.
It really is. We're going to dive into how Donald Trump's unprecedented annexation threats transformed from what people thought was just a real estate whim into a systemic shock for NATO and the rules-based world order.
Yeah, we really need to look at the mechanics of how it moves so incredibly fast. I mean, we're talking about a timeline that escalated from late-night social media posts to the deployment of elite combat troops, and then to the brink of a global trade war.
All in just a few months. Now, really quickly, because the intelligence leaks and the diplomatic cables we're analyzing today are so politically radioactive, involving the U.S., Europe, the Trump administration, our job here isn't to judge the politics. We're not taking sides or endorsing any viewpoints here.
Right, absolutely not. That's not the goal.
We are strictly looking under the hood at the geopolitical mechanics, impartially analyzing the facts and the shockwaves detailed in these reports.
Which is really the only way to understand a crisis of this magnitude. You have to separate the political rhetoric from the tactical reality on the ground.
Totally. Okay, so let's establish the baseline. How did a decades-old alliance suddenly find itself staring down the barrel of a gun? Let's trace the timeline.
Well, it started back in 2024, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in 2024, Trump was calling the ownership of Greenland an absolute necessity. But by January 2026, those statements had devolved into explicit threats of taking the territory the hard way.
And the shift from this, financial proposition to a military imperative is what caught European leaders so completely off guard. The administration was suddenly willing to use every coercive tool in the playbook.
And the details of this pressure campaign are genuinely surreal. I mean, there are these bizarre, highly specific anecdotes in the sources. Like, in early 2025, Donald Trump Jr. physically shows up in Nuuk, the capital of Greenland, handing out Magie hats to locals.
Yeah, the Magie hats. And then there was that image online, too.
Oh, right. The AI-generated image posted by Trump of himself, J.D. Vance, and Marco Rubio heroically planting a U.S. flag on Greenlandic soil.
It's just wild.
But the craziest part, the most staggering piece of evidence, is this leaked text message sent to the Prime Minister of Norway.
Yes. That text message is basically the Rosetta Stone for understanding this escalation.
It really is. In it, Trump explicitly links his push to take over Greenland to a perceived personal snub. He basically texts that because Norway didn't give him the Nobel Peace Prize, he no longer felt any obligation to, quote, think purely of peace.
Wow. And, what's fascinating here is that when you look at these events in isolation, the hats, the AI flags, the text message, it's easy to dismiss them as just erratic behavior.
Right, just random noise.
Exactly. But geopolitical analysts see a very recognizable strategy. It's a textbook example of hybrid warfare against an ally.
Okay, wait, let's unpack this for a second, because usually when we talk about hybrid warfare, we're talking about Russia, right?
Usually, yes.
It's like a landlord offering to buy out a tenant, but when the tenant says no, the landlord starts slipping eviction notices under the door and parking a bulldozer on the lawn.
That is a great analogy. Hybrid warfare relies on operating just below the threshold of a kinetic military response. And the U.S. used intelligence agencies, covert marketing, literally handing out U.S. dollars in Nuuk to foster pro-American sentiment.
Oh, wow. And there was severe diplomatic pressure too, right?
Unilateral diplomatic pressure, like appointing Jeff Landry as a special envoy to Greenland, completely uninvited. It was designed to destabilize the realm of Denmark and bypass Copenhagen completely.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here because I'm stuck on the fundamental math of this. Greenland is mostly ice. Why Greenland? Why risk blowing up NATO over an island of ice?
Well, the math makes sense when you look at it through the lens of great power competition with China and Russia. The U.S. views the Arctic as the next major theater of conflict.
Ah, okay.
And Greenland sits right at the edge of the GI-UK gap.
GI-UK gap, that's Greenland, Iceland, and the UK, right?
Exactly. It's a critical naval choke point. If Russian submarines want to get into the open Atlantic Ocean, They have to pass through that gap.
Yeah.
Controlling Greenland gives you the high ground to essentially bottle up the Russian Navy.
Okay, so that's the naval side. Was there something else?
Yeah, the Golden Dome missile defense system. Greenland's location makes it the absolute perfect, non-negotiable real estate for early warning radars to shoot down incoming missiles over the North Pole.
So for the U.S. administration, a polite treaty just wasn't enough. They wanted total control.
Right. They argued it was a strategic requirement for American survival.
Which brings us to the tripwire. This is the part that genuinely astonished me. Denmark didn't just write an angry letter to the UN. They actually prepared for war against the United States.
They really did. They felt they had no other choice.
There's this standing order in the Danish military from 1952. It explicitly requires their troops to, and I'm quoting here, shoot first and ask questions later if Danish territory is attacked.
Yeah, it's a relic of the early Cold War, meant for a surprise Soviet invasion. But international law doesn't care if the invader is a Soviet adversary or an American ally.
An attack is an attack. So Denmark deploys elite combat troops under General Peter Harling-Boysen straight into Greenland.
But obviously, Denmark knew it couldn't win a conventional war against the Pentagon.
Right, it's 6 million people versus the U.S. military.
Exactly. And that is where the Allied response comes in. This is Operation Arctic Endurance.
Instead of abandoning Denmark, European NATO members deployed their own forces.
Yes. France, the UK, Germany, and the Nordic nations all sent military forces to Greenland under the guise of an exercise.
And this introduces this incredible geopolitical concept, the tripwire force.
It's fascinating. These European troops weren't there to defeat the U.S. military. They were there to be in the way.
To guarantee that if the U.S. attacked, they'd be shooting French, British, and German soldiers.
Exactly. It forces a catastrophic decision. If the U.S. kills a French or British soldier, NATO's Article 5 Mutual Defense Clause is triggered, practically forcing a broader war.
It's like the Cold War American tripwire in West Berlin, but flipped on its head.
Exactly. They turned the U.S.'s own deterrence playbook against it.
So this military standoff completely backed the U.S. into a corner. They couldn't launch a strike without triggering a catastrophic conflict with their own allies.
Right. Kinetic warfare was off the table.
So they had to shift the battlefield. Which brings us to the economic front, the tariff threat.
The administration pivoted to economic warfare. Trump threatened a punishing 25% tariff on the European nations that participated in Operation Arctic Endurance.
Basically trying to tax Europe into abandoning Denmark. But the European counterstrike was unprecedented. They were completely unified.
They were. French President Emmanuel Macron gave this blistering speech warning against vassalage.
And the EU prepared to deploy this new tool, the Anti-Coercion Instrument, or ACI. Analysts vividly dubbed it the trade bazooka.
The trade bazooka. I love that term.
It's so good. But how exactly did the bazooka work?
Well, the EU had prepared a massive $93 billion tariff package, and it was highly targeted. They specifically aimed at goods from Republican-controlled U.S. states.
Oh, wow. So they're targeting the president's own political base to apply maximum domestic pressure.
Exactly. Hitting bourbon, motorcycles, agriculture, bypassing Washington, and hitting the voting base directly.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because Europe is often criticized for being, slow and bureaucratic, but suddenly they mobilize this massive financial weapon.
Right, almost overnight.
Did Europe actually have the leverage here? I mean, the U.S. economy is huge. Was this just a giant bluff?
It wasn't a bluff at all. The leverage was very real. To prove it, the EU formally paused the ratification of a massive 2025 trade agreement with the U.S.
Wait, really? They hit pause on a major deal just to prove a point.
Yeah, they signaled they were willing to absorb immediate economic pain to defend the core principle of territorial sovereignty. Because if they let the U.S. swallow Greenland, Europe could be next.
Wow. So we have this military tripwire in the snow and this economic bazooka loaded in Brussels. And it all comes to a head in the Swiss Alps.
Yes, the climax of the crisis.
Yeah.
January 21st, 2026, at the World Economic Forum in Davos.
After days of escalating threats and, I should add, a speech where Trump weirdly confused Iceland with Greenland, he abruptly backed down.
He did. And it was thanks to what strategists called the Davos solution.
Brokered by NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte.
Exactly. Rutte stepped slightly outside his formal mandate to create an off-ramp for the U.S. president. He used a lot of flattery and created this vaguely defined framework concerning the Golden Dome project and mineral development.
Basically allowing Trump to save face on the global stage.
Right. He built him a golden bridge to retreat across.
But the reality was, it was an illusion of a deal. Danish and Greenlandic officials immediately clarified that sovereignty was never negotiated.
Never. The deal was essentially just a recommitment to the pre-existing 1951 U.S.-Denmark Treaty. The status quo didn't change at all.
Which introduces my new favorite foreign policy acronym, the taco moment.
Yes, the taco moment. It stands for the total abandonment of coercive objectives.
Total abandonment of coercive objectives. It perfectly describes this great climb down. It exposed the absolute limits of his coercive powers.
Because when he was met with a unified military wall and a unified economic wall, the unilateral pressure campaign just folded.
So the immediate crisis is averted. But what does this all mean for the rest of the world? I mean, the global fallout had to be massive.
Oh, the fallout was profound. U.S. adversaries were watching very closely. Russia was absolutely delighted by the chaos.
I bet. Because they could use the U.S.'s imperialist rhetoric to justify their own actions, right?
Exactly. They used it to retroactively justify their own annexation of Crimea. Like, look, the Americans think great powers have a right to expand, so why are we being sanctioned?
Oh, man, what a propaganda gift. And what about China?
China saw a golden opportunity. They watched the fractured trust between the U.S. and Europe and saw a chance to strengthen their own economic ties with Brussels, pitching themselves as the stable alternative to an erratic America.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, it really sounds like the end of the old NATO.
It was a systemic shock. The transatlantic relationship suffered a massive blow. It proved that the rules-based world order, where large nations don't just swallow smaller ones, was no longer guaranteed by the United States.
Which forced Europe to wake up. It massively accelerated their push for strategic autonomy. Well,
yes, moving away from absolute reliance on the U.S. security umbrella and toward intra-European defense frameworks, they realized they had to be able to protect themselves.
From their own ally. Wow. Okay, let's briefly recap this incredible journey today. We started with a leaked text message complaining about a Nobel Prize.
Which fueled a campaign that led to elite Danish troops preparing to fire on Americans.
That military tripwire shifted the conflict to the economic realm, where Europe loaded a 93 billion euro trade bazooka.
And ultimately forced a face-saving taco moment exit at Davos.
It's just wild, and it leaves us, and you, listening, with a lingering question to ponder on your own. The Greenland crisis was resolved with a handshake in Davos and a return to the status quo. But the taboo of threatening to conquer an ally has been permanently broken.
That bell cannot be unrung.
Exactly. So when the next superpower decides that the international rules no longer apply to them, will a tripwire force and a trade bazooka be enough to stop them? Or was this just a dress rehearsal for the end of the post-war global order?
It's a terrifying thought.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, and we'll see you next time.